So now we need to take a look at some other government rights they have in land. And you see a term here called eminent domain. Promise you you'll see that again as well. Y'all, eminent domain basically is the right the government or state, more specifically, has to take private property for public use. Now, for the state to just take your property or some portion of your property, there are some requirements that have to be made. Okay, there are two requirements that must be met, rather. One, the reason they're taking the property has to be for public benefit. In other words, they can't just take your property and give it to somebody else. The reason they're taking it must be for public benefit. And then two, if they're going to take your property, then just compensation must be paid. They have to reimburse you for whatever the value of that property they're taking would be. An example, and there are a lot of different examples, but maybe they're widening a road from 2 lanes to 4 lanes. And to do that, if you live or own property on that road, then obviously they're going to have to take a portion of your property that's near the road. And that is for public benefit. So it's not like they're taking it, giving it to somebody else. They're widening the road that would benefit the public. But again, they do have to pay you for that. Now, you also, I want to make sure you catch this. You see a term there called condemnation. Condemnation, that's the legal procedure exercised by the state to exercise the right of eminent domain. They just call it condemnation. The reason I want to bring this up is because, and certainly for test purposes, a lot of times they'll use the word condemnation in lieu of eminent domain. So if you see eminent domain or condemnation, it's the same thing. Okay? It's just the state's authority to take private property for public use. But then you'll also notice where it talks about the delegation of power, which, that is important. The delegation of power rests with the state general assembly, in order to exercise the right of eminent domain. So in case they should ask you, where's the delegation of power? That's the state general assembly. Okay. All right. So, that's eminent domain. But then kind of in line with eminent domain is something called inverse condemnation. Now, remember we said condemnation, same as eminent domain. So that's what we're talking about here. But there's a term called inverse condemnation. And basically what has happened is, the state or the government has done something, even though they have not taken any of your property. They're not compensating you in any way because, again, they're not taking your property. But because of some action taken by the government, it has a it has a negative impact on your property. Maybe it impacts the way you can use the property, or it impacts the economic benefit or use of the property. It severely hurts what you can or cannot do with the property because of some action the state has taken or something they've done. In a situation like this, if you can show inverse condemnation, then you may very well be entitled to some compensation from the state if you can show this, whatever this negative impact is that you're asserting. But that's called inverse condemnation. Okay. Another right the state has is something called escheat. Escheat takes place when someone dies intestate. Intestate means you died without a will. Testate means you died with a will. Intestate means you died without a will. Well, if you die intestate or without a will, and the state cannot locate any legal heirs, then what's going to happen to any property you leave behind? It reverts over to the state via escheat. So now the state will own the property. But again, make sure you remember, the definition. The state can only exercise this right of escheat if you die without a will or you die intestate, and they cannot locate or find any legal heirs that you left behind. Okay, so that's escheat. The next thing we talk about here is something called police power. And with this police power, and we're going to talk about several examples of it, the government can put a lot of controls on land, on real estate, and we call these public controls. Okay, but first of all, what is police power? It says it's authority granted by the government to enforce certain laws, regulations, or policies. So police power is authority granted by the state. It could be granted to an individual, could be to an office, could be to an organization. But whoever has been granted this police power, they can basically take any action they deem necessary to enforce certain rules or laws or regulations. Anything that they've been put in control of enforcing. With this police power, they can take whatever action necessary to enforce whatever they're in control of. Now, we're getting ready to talk about several different examples of what this might look like. And we start out with something called restrictive powers. Just for example, the Real Estate Commission. The Real Estate Commission has police power to enforce the real estate licensing laws. And again, because they have this police power, they can take any action necessary to enforce the law. So if you don't comply with the law, they could suspend your license. They could fine you. They could revoke your license. There's any number of things they could do in order to enforce the licensing laws. That's one example of police power. Another example would be zoning laws. If you own land, you can't just do anything you want to do with it. You can only use it based on what it was zoned to be used for. And there could be any number of zoning classifications or categories, and you see a few examples of those right now. It might be zoned residential, which means then you must use that land for residential purposes. If it's zoned commercial, then you must use it for commercial purposes. And then and right on down the list here, I'm not going to sit here and name all of them, but look, land has all of it zoned to be used in a particular manner or for a particular purpose. And you got to use it for that purpose. Now, I will tell you, as a real estate agent, this is going to be important to you. You need to pay attention when, if you're representing a buyer, you need to pay attention to what they expect and plan to do, okay, what their objectives are. You don't want to mess around and just buy some land just because they like it, looks good, good price, and then find out it's not zoned to do what they told you they wanted to do. You better make sure you know what the property is zoned for, okay? And I will tell you, zoning changes. And I'm sure you're familiar with this, but you have a lot of residential homes that at the time the house was built, that land was zoned residential. But now it may be zoned commercial. So you actually have a residential house sitting on a piece of land that is now zoned commercial. So if someone buys that property, they have to now use it based on what the property is zoned for. So if someone buys this residential house thinking they're going to get to move in here and live here, they're going to be very upset when they find out they cannot live there. You say, but it's a house. It doesn't matter. It's now zoned commercial. So that means you would have to convert the house to be used for commercial purposes. Okay? Stuff like that, I'm telling you, will cause you a lot of grief. So you got to pay attention. Make sure you know what land is zoned for, and don't just assume because there's a house on the property that it is necessarily zoned residential. More than likely it would be. But I'm sure you know as well as I do, there are a lot of residential homes now sitting in areas that have been rezoned commercial or some other zoning classification. All right, so be careful with that. And then here, a couple terms or definitions you need to be familiar with concerning zoning laws. Sometimes you hear the term ordinance, zoning ordinance. And the intent of these zoning laws or ordinances, it says the primary intent is to assure that the proposed land uses conform with the master plan. Now, first of all, who has the master plan? Jesus. That would be the best answer. Unfortunately, that's probably not going to be the answer they're looking for on the exam. So what are they looking for on the exam? The state. The state basically decides what's the best use of all land within the state, and they'll zone it accordingly. But then they will have, they will issue police power or push police power down to local municipalities. More than likely, each municipality will have their own planning and zoning commission. Well, that commission has police power to enforce the master plan at their local level. Okay? So let's talk more about what is this master plan. It says it's a document designed to guide the future actions of the community, and it presents a vision for the future with long-range goals and objectives for activities that affect the local government. So basically, whatever the government feels like, whatever they deem the best use of any land would be, then they'll zone it for that use. And then if you should acquire it or purchase it, then you must use that land based on what the government has zoned it to be used for. So that it all fits into this master plan. Then everybody be happy. Okay. You see a term called variance. You need to know what a variance is. But basically, is it possible that you could own land zoned commercial, just for example? And by the way, when it comes to commercial zoning, there are different levels of commercial zoning, like C1, C2, and so forth. And the reason they break out commercial zoning into separate classifications is because, there are certain types of businesses that you're not allowed to have or run in certain areas of town. So the government will have a lot to say about that as well. Well, say for example, I own this land and it is zoned commercial, but it's not zoned for the type of commercial classification that I want to use it for. Well, an option would be you could go to the Planning and Zoning Commission and request a variance. Now, by requesting a variance, in essence, you're asking the Planning and Zoning Commission to rezone your property so that you can use it based on what you want to use it for. Now, I will tell you, they will do stuff like that. They do it quite a bit. But the key is this. When you request a variance, obviously there's going to be a fair amount of paperwork involved, and you basically got to write up what it is you intend to do with the property. But you also need to be very clear on by changing the classification, how would that benefit the public? That's what the Planning and Zoning Commission is going to be most interested in. If all you put in your request for the variance is how it's going to increase your revenue, probably not going to get much traction there. But if you can convince them that what you're planning to do would benefit the public, then you stand a much better chance of getting the variance. And obviously if you get the variance, they change the zoning classification and you can go ahead and do whatever it is you plan to do. But that's what a variance would be. Another term is called non-conforming use. And this kind of goes in line with something I was just talking about. In fact, if you recall, we were talking about, say you got a residential home, and obviously at the time the house was built, that the land was zoned residential. But since that time, they have now rezoned the property as commercial. Well, y'all, if you happen to be living in the house at the time they rezoned to commercial, does that mean you now have to move out? Do you now have to use that house as commercial property? And the answer is no. Y'all, in essence, you're going to be grandfathered in. Y'all, that's what this non-conforming use means. Y'all, because when you purchase the property, you purchased it and are using it based on what it was zoned for at the time you purchased it. But because now they've rezoned it, y'all, they will allow you to continue living there in what we call a non-conforming use. So even though it does not currently comply with the zoning law or classification, you're still allowed to stay there under those circumstances. So y'all, again, in essence, you're grandfathered. But what you want to be careful of here is if that property owner decides to sell the property, then y'all, this needs to be disclosed to potential buyers that you can't buy this house with the expectation of living here, because they've they've changed the zoning to commercial or some other zoning. So whoever buys it will now have to comply with the new zoning requirements. Okay, but that's what non-conforming use means. Then you see a term called spot zoning. Spot zone, that's really what it kind of sounds like. You could have like a little small spot zone, a small area of where you got a cluster maybe of residential houses, but surrounded by all commercial buildup. So you got this little spot zone right in the middle of some other type of zoning, or vice versa. I don't think that's too big a deal there. But then this next term is called a buffer zone. Now, y'all, this is one not only for test purposes you need to be familiar with, but y'all, you need to be careful with this, again, when you're practicing real estate. But y'all, a buffer zone is required anytime you have two adjacent parcels of land with two different zone types. Like you got a residential property here and a commercial property here, and they're adjacent to each other. Well, y'all, anytime you have two conflicting zone types like that, y'all, there has to be something that separates those two zone types. And they call that a buffer zone. Now, whatever's there can be really anything. It could be a wall, could be a ditch, could be a fence. Sometimes it's just vacant land where they'll have, maybe 30-foot zone that has to be used as a buffer zone. And by the way, if they say this is a 30-foot buffer zone, then there's nothing you can do. Now, you can own the buffer zone and you're still paying taxes on it, but you can't do anything with it, because you can't do anything inside of the buffer zone. In fact, I will tell you an example question they could ask. Might say you got residential houses adjacent to commercial buildings, and right between the two is a small park. What might you refer as that park as being? That'd be a buffer zone. Anything that separates two different zone types is considered a buffer zone. That's what that is. Okay. And then occasionally you see something we call a moratorium. A real estate moratorium. I don't know how often you see these, but occasionally you do. And I'm going to tell you, when they issue these moratoriums, it can cause some issues for sure. But it says, a moratorium refers to a temporary suspension or restriction on certain real estate activities, development, or transactions imposed by the government. So they can restrict building. They can say, well, we got a moratorium in this area and you cannot build any more houses. Y'all, they could do stuff, and they do stuff like that. But it says the purpose of the moratorium is typically to address specific concerns or issues such as environmental impact, infrastructure limitations, housing market stability, or zoning regulation. Y'all, those are some of the purposes that they might issue a moratorium. But boy, when that happens, I'm telling you, when they issue stuff like that, it really causes issues within the real estate market for sure. But that's what a moratorium means. They've restricted some kind of development or building or something of that nature. All right. And then to wrap up these zoning laws, there's something called a special use permit. And it says these are granted by local governments to allow property owner to use their land for a purpose that is not typically permitted under the current zoning regulations. To do stuff like this, you will have to go to the Planning Zoning Commission. They will hold a hearing. And basically, and the hearing is usually open to the public, so the other members of the public would know what you're trying to do or wanting to do. And if you had, as long as everybody was okay with it, then they'll probably go ahead and issue what they call a conditional use permit. Obviously they're issued on a case-by-case basis. But if you had a few people show up to the hearing that voiced a lot of concerns or issues with what you're trying to do, good chance you're not going to get the permit. Okay? But that's what they call a special use permit.